So I've been given an opening address, which I guess is a bit of a taster to get you guys in the mode of thinking about what you're going to get out of the next couple of days. It's really, really important to kind of have a strategy for conferences you attend. It's not about passive absorption of knowledge, but coming in and getting what you need out of this experience. So why are we here and where are we going? I love this quote by Mary Midgley. People in general have perhaps thought of animal welfare as they've thought of drains, a worthy but not a particularly interesting subject. That was a little while ago now. The great news is that animal welfare science has really, really increased awareness around animal welfare. And it's asking really important questions that we're able to use the answers to more and more. But within organisations that do animal welfare, there's a need to keep asking ourselves some tough and sometimes confronting questions. A little bit about myself. I'm an anxious optimist, I think. That's how I'd categorise myself. So I'm a worst case scenario thinker. And when I went through vet school, the way I often learned about things was I'd think, and some people might think this is a bit psychotic, but I would think, how do I kill an animal using this? How do I kill someone with this technique? Not because I wanted to do that, far from it. In fact, I wanted to do the opposite. But by learning what the worst thing was that could happen, I would somehow learn to avoid that. That's just my style of thinking. And there's a book about it. I didn't write it, but shows that it's quite legit and okay. There's also the Complete Worst Case Scenario Survival Handbook, which I have a copy of, quite helpful. When things go wrong, I don't know about you guys, but I tend to often blame myself as well. And my life is a process of trying to refine that so that it's not a matter of self-flagellation, but it's more a matter of reflection and thinking, how can I do better? Am I causing unintended harm, and is there a way I can refine that or stop that? And so in my mind, I have this mini morbidity and mortality conference, and that's a way that I learn things. Why am I here? I love this quote by Arthur Bloomfield. As a private practitioner, when I euthanize animals, and some of you have been in this position, clients will say often, this is the worst part of your job. This must be the most terrible thing ever. And it's actually not. The worst part of my job is causing unintended harm. I think many of you would agree with that. When you find out that you've been responsible for a consequence that you couldn't foresee, or that an animal suffered because of something that you've done, that's got to be, I think, one of the worst feelings in the world. So an example of a potential harm, I had a beautiful big mastiff who was a patient of mine, and he had bilateral cruciate ligament disease, which was treated to the highest standard by a specialist, and he was isolated and contained as part of his recovery. Unfortunately, that dog orthopedically recovered beautifully, behaviourally deteriorated to such an extent he was euthanized for aggressive behaviour that couldn't be controlled. It was a terrible, terrible outcome, and one that we didn't want. That, I think, sort of captures one of the worst aspects of my job. There's a point to this. This slide shows my late cat, Lil Puss. She was diagnosed with cancer. The very next day I treated her with chemotherapy, and unfortunately she had a freak, rare adverse reaction and died very quickly. It was incredibly peaceful, and I think on reflection it was probably the best thing that could have happened for Lil, who wasn't a big fan of the vets, but it was really devastating at the time because that was not my intention. That wasn't the plan. And I guess one of the most confronting things for me in my career is reading all the literature that's coming about, and literature that I enjoy reading about fear-free veterinary clinics, low-stress handling animals, and understanding that some of the things that we do to help animals can harm them as well. So if I think about the animals that we keep in hospital unsupervised on drips overnight, or the fact that we're still using rectal thermometers and no one has invented an alternative for that. Come on, guys. These are the things that, although we're vets and we're trying to help animals, sometimes there's these harmful consequences as well. So there are some consequences that we can predict and others that we can't, but we can learn from all of them. And that's really important, because I think if you get weighed down by these things, if you feel completely overwhelmed by them, then you can maybe question your choice of career. But the people who keep going, the people who stick with it, are the ones that actually learn from that experience and grow and try to do it better. This is Professor Bernard Rowland, who I actually spent a bit of time with a couple of years ago. A form of unintended harm that we're probably all familiar with is the stress of killing healthy animals in shelters and pounds, and that's why we're here, right? We want to avoid that. So Professor Bernard Rowland famously drew attention to this issue in the 1980s. He talked about a thing called moral stress, and he said, isn't it terribly cruel that the people who love animals the most, the people who want to help them, are drawn to this work in shelters, and yet they're the ones that are then forced, because of the nature of their work, to actually end the lives of healthy animals. Isn't that just terrible? So he drew attention to this, and he drew attention to this issue of moral stress, which exists in lots of professions, but particularly in working with animals. And that's become linked to studies about compassion fatigue. And we know now that compassion fatigue is behind illness, and in some cases deaths, of people working in shelters and pounds, that it can result in really high staff turnover and unhappiness in the workplace, suboptimal collegial relations, poor animal welfare. Why does moral stress occur? Because ultimately, people feel that their intention to help animals isn't borne out in their work. And in fact, they feel complicit in the harming of animals. And it also occurs when people feel that what they do in their work doesn't align with their personal values. So this has really driven shelters and pounds to consider different strategies to reduce euthanasia and improve the welfare of animals as well as people. I work on a laboratory animal ethics committee. It's one of the things that I do, and we talk about refinement. Many of you are familiar with the 3 R's. So refinement is working within an existing system to try and improve the way things are done, to bring them up to best practice. And this is Doug Fakkema, who some of you will be familiar with, who's been a lifelong advocate of euthanasia by injection, something a lot of us take for granted in Australia. But when he started working in an animal shelter in the 1970s, when he was a conscientious objector to the Vietnam War, and he was given this job in a shelter, he was taking animals into a CO2 decompression chamber. It was pretty awful. He said on his first day on the job, he showed up at 8 a.m. The first minute he was there, a shelter employee named Bob greeted him and told him to come back. So he followed him out to the back, put a dog on a lead, put it into a cage on wheels. There was no orientation, he said. There was no training. I didn't get a tour. They had me pick this dog up and put it into the cage, so I did that. I shoved the cage into this weird-looking machine and closed the door, latched it, and hit the green button. And that weird-looking machine was a decompression chamber. So it was widely used in the US in the 70s, long since been banned, and in 2007, the AVMA in their euthanasia guidelines said, well, there were plenty of reasons for doing that. One of the reasons was they weren't really designed for working with animals in that way. They'd been designed to work at a much faster rate than was optimum for animal welfare, and that resulted in pain and distress. But also when animals were unconscious, there was some pretty awful effects like bleeding and vomiting and so on. They thought that was upsetting. It's really important that we have people like Doug who refine the processes, who make this better. And he talks about euthanasia should always be done by a trained person. It should always be done with sedation, and it should always be done by lethal injection. And he spent his whole career doing that. That's really incredible. But there's also scope for replacement. So we talk about in laboratory animals, replacing the use of laboratory animals with non-animal models altogether. And that's the holy grail. That's supposedly why ethics committees exist. And we want to replace euthanasia. Now, there's lots of strategies for doing that. So, and many of you, most of you, in fact, probably all of you are already doing things that are designed to replace euthanasia or avoid it altogether. And they're things like reducing admissions to shelters by controlling populations, promoting early age desexing, and so on. Increasing reclaims, ensuring animals are getting back home, ensuring their registration details are absolutely up to date, reducing resurrenders by providing outreach, reducing behavioural deterioration by reducing length of stay, reducing physical morbidity through best practice, disease control, disinfection, cleaning, vaccination, all of those things. But we also need to ask some hard questions as well. Are we doing it all the right way? Probably most of you are familiar with this paper by Gary Patronek and Janice Bradley, who basically concluded that behavioural evaluations in shelters are no better than flipping a coin. For many people, this is really uncomfortable reading because many of us have been doing behavioural evaluations. And they say that, lots of people do them and their aim is to try to refine them and do them better. They admit that there's limitations to behavioural evaluations, but if you could just do it a little bit better, if you could just refine it a bit more, then we might actually get it right. But they put together a mathematical model and say that in terms of predictive value, these evaluations are no better than flipping a coin. And for the dogs that get the false positive result, they're worse than flipping a coin. They argue that shelters are already vetting out obviously dangerous dogs from adoption during that intake process. And they say that resources would be better spent maximising opportunities to interact with dogs in normal and enjoyable ways that mirror what they expected to do once adopted, i.e. walking, socialising with people, play groups with other dogs, games and so on. It's a controversial position because lots of us invested a lot of resources into behavioural evaluations, and lots of staff, importantly, have been involved in life and death decision making on the basis of these. But if we assume this paper is correct, are we obliged to do something about what the data is telling us? We also need to think about what's our end game, and sometimes that seems so far away because you're dealing with this constant tide of animals, putting out fires every day, trying to chase up owners who haven't updated their details, looking at complicated surrenders and so on. It's just hard to find the time in any day to think about what's the ultimate end, what are we actually doing here? Should shelters be pursuing their own redundancy? Should we really be trying to grow, or should we actually be trying to not exist at all? Is the end game empty shelters? Some might say, well, that's never going to happen in my lifetime, especially if you're dealing with all these issues. But some say, actually, it might. And there's a very confronting book. Has anyone read Run, Spot, Run? Okay, good. It's a really interesting book. It's written by a pet owner, and it's essentially about the problems with pets. And one of the very provocative questions that the bioethicist Jessica Pearce asks in this book is whether shelters are part of the problem they seek to address. She writes, ultimately the goal, it seems to me, should be empty shelters. But a shelter without animals, or with only 3 or 4 animals, cannot thrive. Shelters rely on a high census, and adopting out as many animals as possible to maintain the flow of funding, which not only keeps animals fed, but pays the meagre salaries of shelter employees. Most importantly, shelters keep the pet industry from crashing in on itself, since shelters contain the surplus and thus keep the market for new product healthy. Ooh, wow. That's very provocative. And I wrote to her about this and I said, wow, this is amazing. I'm not quite sure the point that you're trying to make about shelters. And she said, I really value what they're doing, but what I'm not coping with is the fact that they are part of a bigger industry that I have ethical problems with, and I'm not sure how one could exist without the other. So Mark Westman, who some of you might know him, he started Pets in the Park, or was one of the co-founders of Pets in the Park. We got together and we tried to imagine, okay, well, what would it take to have a world without shelters? And these were a couple of the ideas. You probably can think of some others, but we thought, okay, a world without shelters. Well, first of all, animals would have no behaviour problems at all, which would mean that all owners would have no behaviour problems. Like, we would get it, right? We'd understand what was normal and what was not, and we'd have no issues, and that'd be fine. We'd highly value all our animals and give them lots of time. We'd invest heaps of time. Every puppy would go to puppy preschool. No ifs or buts. And we'd have pet-friendly accommodation. Who's ever struggled to find accommodation with animals? Yeah. Well, in our world, with no shelters, every place would be totally pet-friendly. No problems renting. And everyone who broke up would have really friendly separations, at least when it came to animals. And we'd totally share custody with every animal for the term of its natural life. Even if you broke up with someone when you had a kitten and it died at the age of 23, you'd still be friends with that person and, cat sit for them when they went away with their new partner. What a wonderful world. Everyone would be microchipped. Everyone would update their details. No animal cruelty, no animal hoarding. Neighbours would support other neighbours in keeping pets. There'd be environmental enrichment for all animals and accessible veterinary care. Hey, maybe it's even free. Wouldn't that be great? Well, the truth is, we actually need shelters. They have to be there. We need them as a safety net. Stuff happens and animals need it. But I guess the idea is, and this was a sort of an analogy that Nell told me, which I thought was kind of cute. They're like a sort of a trampoline. The animals bounce in and you bounce them out. Not literally, but hopefully quickly with a minimal length of stay into a new forever home or back to the home where they came from. It's why managed intake needs to be more of a thing. And lots of organisations, lots of shelters and pounds are moving to policies that are a bit more like, we are going to help you if you can help us get the best outcome for your animal. And this is a space that we need to keep watching. It's where outreach services come into play. If we think about ideal shelter facilities, is yours it? And how do you know? Well, you might want to ask yourself some questions like, is my organisational purpose aligned with my facility size and housing choice and number? Is it a comfortable and efficient working environment? Is it a welcoming and cheerful space for the public and for volunteers and for animals, for staff? Is it aligned with community interventions to manage animal overpopulation and other animal welfare concerns like cruelty? Are the staff and volunteers well trained? Do they practice low stress handling? Are there conscious systematic attempts to reduce stress of all the beings in the facility, the humans and the non-humans? Is there an opportunity for time outside of enclosures for the animals that want or need it? What are the 24-hour staffing arrangements? Are there links to social services like women's shelters, best practice infection control, high volunteer engagement, low staff turnover? Blacktown City Council on August 27 released some info about a facility that they want to fund, which is going to be a state-of-the-art animal rehoming centre, about $30 million. And the idea of this, it's almost like someone's got the idea of a dream shelter and made a plan for it. So these are a couple of the features that it has. It's going to look after lost, stray and abandoned animals for up to 15 councils in neighbouring areas, representing about 1.5 million Sydney residents. It's going to include 200 dog kennels, 180 cat condos for animals waiting to be rehomed, a cafe to actually draw people to come and hang out, maybe spend time with animals, a state-of-the-art veterinary hospital in partnership with Sydney University with 3 operating theatres and a lecture hall and student accommodation on site, 24-hour veterinary care, a dedicated greyhound rehoming facility in partnership with greyhounds as pets, a pet boarding facility, and a space for people who are victims of domestic violence to house their pets so that they can actually escape an abusive partner. Do you need a $30 million facility to achieve it? It's always a bit of a downer when someone says, hey, this is a great idea, it only costs $30 million. I don't know about you, but I don't have $30 million. So what about turning shelters into sort of things like homes? This is Emily Weiss, and she teamed up with colleagues from the Wisconsin Humane Society, and they brainstormed this idea, and they thought, well, yeah, shelters can be lovely and calm and clean environments, but they're not like home. So wouldn't it be good to get a whole bunch of retirees and people with time and stick them in shelters? What a great idea. And then they could just live with the animals like it was home. And maybe it would stop some of those shelter-specific behaviours that we worry about, like fear aggression and resource guarding. Well, you can imagine getting ethics for that kind of thing. Sticking people in shelters is a little tricky. So they didn't really do that. But they sort of did a version of it. What they did was they did a trial with 52 dogs, and all of these dogs had shelter-identified issues, so fear aggression, or they were barrier reactive, or they were resource guarding, and they put them in foster homes. So instead of putting the people with the dogs, they put the dogs with the people, and the foster carers were asked to provide a warts and all account of the behaviour. And what was interesting was most of the animals did not exhibit that shelter-specific behaviour in the foster homes. So as a result, 45 were safely adopted, 5 were euthanized, 1 went to long-term foster, 1 went to a rescue group, but 88% found homes within 30 days, which is food for thought. Don't have to transform everything you do, don't have to start from scratch every single time. This week you might also pick up some little hacks. So when I was putting this presentation together, I popped into Cat Protection Society in Newtown in Sydney, and I picked up a bunch of hacks, not hacked up fur balls, but like actual little tips that you can use just a really short visit. So I'm just going to talk you through a couple of those, but little hacks that you can incorporate, like spot cleaning for cats, or streamlining the flow of animals in your facility to minimise housing changes and stress, or arranging resources and enclosures to maximise animal welfare and comfort. They're little things you can do without changing the whole system. So think about some of those that you might pick up this week. I love this, disposable PPE. Sometimes you think, oh, well, no, we'll use scrubs, it saves a bit of waste. But think about the money that you save if you can prevent disease being transferred by fomites if you've got something like this, versus if this staff person, I'm trying to be gender non-specific here, this lady takes off her scrubs, walks it through the facility, puts it in the laundry, what's she going to transmit versus just taking off that PPE and binning it straight away? It could be the difference between having an outbreak of disease or not. That's really a very useful thing. Providing levels and extending cages. Can you retrofit a cage to provide a little mezzanine for cats, or a hammock, or something like that to make them more comfortable? Giving them a hide, giving them an elevated space, giving them a separate toilet area. Toilet rolls. Everyone uses toilet paper, well, generally. Why not use these as little disposable treat dispensers? Such a great idea. And the other thing I really love was Cat Protection has a monthly craft club. So people can come along and hang out together. They don't even have to hang out with the cats, they just hang out together, make these enrichment toys and know that they're being used or being sold to save money, and it's a fabulous way to engage volunteers. What was really nice is Cat Protection, when they heard I was doing this talk, gave me some exclusive data to share with you this morning, so they haven't published it yet. But they did some of their own research, and I think it's good because it helps draw your attention to the question of, well, what questions am I asking? Am I asking the right questions? Am I getting the right data? How do I know that what I'm doing is actually being useful here? So they commissioned Ipsos to survey 363 cat owners and 156 non-cat owners, and they learned a few interesting things. So I guess the good news is lots of people are getting cats secondhand. They're not going out and getting purebred cats. Lots of them are going out and getting cats from shelters and cats from friends and so on. So I think that we should be happy with that. Only 1 in 10 were not desexed, so I think we should be happy with that as well. But this I found really fascinating. The people who'd never had their cat desexed thought it was lots more costly than the people who'd had their cats desexed and actually paid for the procedure. As this chart shows, if 20% of non-desexers think it's too expensive to desex their cat, where are they getting this information about costs from? Is this just a matter of actually promoting costs? Would it be something so simple? If that's the biggest barrier to desexing, can't we just fix that right now? Of the non-cat owners, those who said they wouldn't desex their cat expected the cost of desexing to be higher than those who said they would. How do we challenge people's perceptions? Well, we have to know what their perceptions are in the first place, and this was an unexpected finding. The survey found that if owners were aware of the benefits of desexing, over 90% would desex all of their cats. This was when I went to Europe and I saw testicles. It doesn't happen very often. Being from Sydney, I'm used to not seeing any at all. But anyway, in relation to desexing of dogs, are there some questions that we're a little bit scared to ask? Recent studies have suggested there may be some health risks as well as benefits to desexing dogs. What about the age of desexing? There is debate about the extent to which exposure to gonadal hormones may reduce the risk of unwelcome behaviours. So, and I know this is a really controversial question to ask in a room full of probably very dedicated neutering types, are there any negative behavioural impacts of desexing? If there are, we should find out and we need to know about it, because the question is, do the benefits outweigh the risks? And maybe they do, but it'd be good to know for sure. It would be concerning if desexing on the one hand reduced numbers of unwanted dogs by reducing litters, but increased the risk of undesirable behaviours that made those dogs less appealing. It may remain the case that the population control benefits outweigh the behavioural risks, but please watch this space very carefully in the next few weeks. Think about your barriers to change, and I love Nell's motto, don't be a barrier. How often in life do we block things? And there's some good reasons, but when you have no time, you're less creative, you're busy putting out fires, change becomes a threat, and evaluations of outcomes is postponed or never undertaken at all. But how do we know what we're doing is working? This cartoon is done by a nurse who works at our clinic called Eileen, and I just need to say, she designed this dress that I'm wearing, which is my dog Phil. I had to say that. I didn't have a picture of him in the presentation, so there he is. But we need to know, how do we know is what we're doing working? What are the outcomes and the impacts, including the good ones as well as the bad ones? Are there any negative impacts? Can we eliminate those or minimize those? What do we need to change and what can we change now? Consider some of the assumptions that you work under this week. Maybe it is that you think behavioural testing, behavioural evaluation in shelters is the holy grail. And that may be the case, but be ready to be challenged about that. Do you have a belief that certain animals just can't be rehomed? Do you need to change your messaging around desexing? Should you reconsider the mandatory length of holding periods? Are you collecting data, and if so, what's it telling you? It's a very confusing quote by Donald Rumsfeld. He said it in February 2002. He was the Secretary of Defense then of the US, and he was talking about weapons of mass destruction, and I'm going to have to read the quote because it's quite hard to remember. Because as we know, there are known knowns. These are the things we know we know. We also know there are known unknowns. That is to say, we know there are some things we do not know, but there are also unknown unknowns. The ones we don't know, we don't know. And if one looks through the history of our country and other free countries, it is the latter category that tend to be the difficult ones. And that's true with animals as well. So I'm going to talk you through one of my unknown unknowns, which I only found out because I had a known unknown. This is my cat Hero. He was from Cat Protection Society, and he'd been yowling at the back door in the middle of the night. These are my neighbour's cats. I don't know what the little tortie's called, but the big fatty Bumbalata is called George. So he's lovely to people, he's a bit of a bastard to Hero. And he had been sneaking into my backyard and looking through the window, upsetting Hero, who then bit me in a case of redirected aggression. So I kind of just wanted to see what's going on in my backyard. And I thought, if I put this camera out, I'm going to bust George. And I wasn't going to do anything with it. It was just a curiosity. I thought, I'll collect some data. And oh my gosh, who is this? This is that's Hero on the other side looking pretty miffed because he only gets out in the daytime. But at night, that's Oscar from down the road. I had no idea he could get into our backyard. So that was an unknown unknown. He's weeing in my compost, in Hero's wee spot. That's totally upsetting Hero, and I had no idea this was going on. George was middening in our backyard, so, you know, the unburied stool, the feline version of the throwing down of the gauntlet, that was definitely going on. So that was I knew that was going on, and that's fine. And then this rat, like dancing in the path that the cats all walk up and down. It was a total unknown. But the point is, I didn't know about my unknown unknowns until I started collecting data. So it's a little lesson there about why it's important. Now, what am I going to do with that? I have no idea. I don't want to kill a rat. This week, this is a little left-wing, kind of out of sort of area, but Roman Krasnarek is a philosopher. He wrote a book about the phrase seizing the day, and he interviewed a whole bunch of people, and I loved this. He interviewed a dramatist who talked about everything being an offer. So in life, he says, most of us are highly skilled at suppressing action. There are people who prefer to say yes, there are people who prefer to say no, but those who say yes are rewarded by the adventures they have, and those who say no are rewarded by the safety they attain, which may not be a bad thing, by the way. But there are far more no-sayers than yes-sayers. So Roman Krasnarek, who wrote the book, says, identify the parts of your lives where you tend to block and consider accepting those as offers instead. What if you did do something about it? What if you thought, actually, let's stop doing behaviour evaluations and let's start doing outreach? What would happen then? Not everything in life is an absolute offer. Losing your job isn't always an offer, but sometimes it creates an opportunity. So turning those kind of ideas into opportunities is really important. So try to think about those things this week. A couple of quotes about making a difference. The School of Life, which is a philosophy school, talks about these traits of hard graft, building relationships, entrepreneurial zeal, and collaboration. Think about all of those things this week. But it's also about testing our hypotheses, collecting and interrogating our data, and being ready to challenge our core assumptions. So, think about this week. What's your end game? What's your plan to get there? What are your known knowns and your known unknowns? And how might you find out about your unknown unknowns? What are the current gaps in your services? Who else has tackled these issues? There's a whole brains trust here. Someone else has dealt with the same problem that you're dealing with, and they've dealt with it successfully. You need to find that person. And ask, collaborate, and swap notes. I was going to pull this quote off the internet, but it happened to be outside one of the supermarkets that I go to, so never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. In fact, it's the only thing that ever has. There you go. That's the end of my talk, and now I'm going to MC, I think.